Well, here we are, folks. Welcome to week number 19 on our Chronological Bible-in-a-Year reading challenge. At the moment, we are well and truly delving into the life and dramas of King David, and that continues this week. 15 Psalms you're going to be reading this week, as well as a few chapters of narrative through the books of 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, as we witness this week the birth of his son and soon-to-be successor, King Solomon. There you go. But until then, sit back, relax, and enjoy today's tutorial. Stay engaged. This week, as per last week, we're reading 15 Psalms, okay, and we're reading 21 chapters of narrative story from the books of 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. Again, we're reading parallel stories or parallel parts of history in this stage of David's life and legacy. As per previous weeks, we're going to see some stuff repeated. In fact, definitely this week, what you're going to notice is that some whole portions of scripture, the chronicler, literally copies and pastes word for word from the book of Samuel, okay? Because remember, Chronicles was written well after, hundreds of years after the book of Samuel. So some of what you're going to read is literally word for word repetition. But what I want to bring your attention to this week is some of the differences in these two books. As I said, a bit like Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John, the Gospels, okay, all tell similar stories but add their different bent to it. So it is very much the case with the book of Samuel and the book of Chronicles, telling parallel stories but with a very different perspective, because they have very different intentions in telling that story. I'm going to highlight some of them in just a moment. But there are two main things that happen this week that help us form the big picture view of the scripture. Last week, King David is king of Israel, makes Jerusalem his capital, brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. This week, we see David expressing a desire to build God a temple in Jerusalem. It's a big point in the plot, okay? To build God a temple. And secondly, we see the birth of David's son Solomon. And as you probably already know, those two things, the temple and Solomon, are very much linked. But here we have some of the differences between the books. Because when Samuel writes about Solomon, he tells us all about Solomon's birth through David's new wife, latest edition, whose name is Bathsheba. However, the book of Chronicles doesn't mention Bathsheba at all. The book of Chronicles mentions Solomon only in the context of him being David's successor and the one who will build the temple in his place. So, with that in mind, let's look at some of the differences again between Samuel and Chronicles. Here's how I'm understanding it. As I see it, the book of Samuel is really focused on the character of David. The good, the bad, and this week, the ugly. Okay, it focuses on the character of David. And so we have a lot of the drama of David's life, particularly relationship dramas. It's in Samuel that we read about his relationship with his father, how his father neglected to bring him to the prophet, how his brothers did not believe in him and mocked him. We see the story of his relationship with with Saul, King Saul, where Saul loved him and then hated him, and loved him and then lied to him. We see the drama of his story and his friendship with Jonathan, and the betrayal of certain soldiers that were against him. All that drama, okay, in David's life is told to us in the book of Samuel, which over and over again highlights David's good character. Well, this week highlights his poor character. Okay, but that's the point of Samuel. One of the points of Samuel is that it highlights David's character. Chronicles isn't cared about David's character really at all. The point of Chronicles is to highlight David's kingdom. And so the book of Chronicles records almost none of the drama in David's life. It has lists, it has names, it has genealogies, it talks about the good stuff of David's reign, the sons that came after him, and paints the picture, as we've said before, of the hope of Israel into the future, who are hoping for another king to come in the line of David. So two differently written books with two different intentions. Samuel focusing on David's character, Chronicles focusing on David's kingdom. And here's how some of that works out this week, things you're going to notice. In the book of Samuel this week, we're told the story of a guy called Mephibosheth. Okay, and Mephibosheth, besides being a funny, lispy name, is the grandson of King Saul. So again, we see this character in David of him honouring the legacy of King Saul and his mate Jonathan. Okay, he honours the line of King Saul. Chronicles doesn't mention that story at all. This week we're going to see the story of David's wife Michal, one of his wives, who actually was King Saul's daughter, who mocks him when he brings the Ark of the Covenant back with extravagant worship. We see an interaction between him and his wife, and we read about how it seems because of that interaction and how she despised him in his heart, she becomes barren. Again, more drama with a lesson about honour and dishonour. Chronicles barely mentions that story at all. This week, we see the story of Bathsheba, and here's probably one of the big ones. You know this. You're going to read it, so I won't repeat it. But this, again, is a story that only comes up in the book of Samuel. And again, it is a story of honour and dishonour. And with dishonour, incidentally, it introduces us to the power of shame. In fact, one of the things you're going to see as you read David's Psalms this week, in one of the Psalms, it begins and ends with him saying, God, don't let me be put to shame. And you're going to see this week how David is trying to save face, okay, in what he did with Bathsheba, in the way that he orchestrated the death of Uriah, in the way that he tried to bribe Uriah into taking the fall, into the way that Nathan the prophet came to him and said, because you did something that dishonoured God or dishonoured Uriah in private, God is going to dishonour you and shame you publicly. And so we see all that story, again, this theme this week, I want you to pick up on dishonour and honour. All of that is written by Samuel. None of that is written in the book of Chronicles. In fact, Bathsheba only gets a mention in one of the genealogies, and not even as Uriah's wife. The chronicler doesn't even tie her, okay, to being the wife of Uriah. When it mentions her in the genealogies, it calls her the daughter of somebody. When over here in Samuel, when Solomon is born, it's in the context of Solomon replacing the dead son that Bathsheba and David had. But over here in Chronicles, it doesn't mention Solomon's birth to Bathsheba at all. All it mentions is that Solomon is going to be the successor of David and be the one who is going to build the temple. So again, we have two very different narrative stories because these two books are intended to communicate different things to different audiences. So I want you to notice that this week. And as you do read this week, one of the things I notice, I've mentioned it now, but I'll just mention it very clearly. Look out for the theme, okay, of honour and dishonour. Honour and dishonour. It's going to come through the narrative, and it's going to also come through the Psalms, particularly the Psalms of David that he writes. So I want you to pay attention to that this week. In fact, it's really interesting. Even in one of the subtle stories, you know, when you notice this, Joab fights, who's one of David's commanders of his army, right? Fights a battle, and David's not on the battle scene. He's out in the palace having a whinge about what happened with Bathsheba, right? So he's out there back home, and Joab says, "Listen, David, if you don't get here, I'm going to name this battle after me, and you're not going to get any credit." And so David comes with his tail between his legs, as it were, and he is shamed into taking credit for that battle because he wants to save face. So even in that little story, which Samuel tells and Chronicles doesn't have a hint to that happening at all, although it does tell the same story, we see this similar vibe because Samuel, the story of Samuel, is all about telling us about David's character. We've seen the good, we've seen humble David, we've seen honourable David, and now we get to see the weakness in this man who is guilty, who is racked with shame, and who is even coerced into doing things because he wants to save face. So we see that in David this week. Pay attention to that. Other than that, you're going to be reading, as I said, 15 Psalms, so I'm sure you're going to enjoy them. Some of them, as per previous weeks, are going to be just songs of expressions of praise to God. Okay, there's a number of good ones in there. Get your highlighter out. You're going to see some great notes. But if there's one Psalm I'd like to highlight to you this week, it is Psalm number 69. And the reason that jumped out at me is because it is quoted over and over again in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, the book of Romans quote Psalm 69, talking about Jesus and the way that he suffered for us and suffered shame for us at the cross of Calvary. I want you to pay attention to Psalm 69 this week. Otherwise, you're reading 15 of them all up. Okay, bless you guys. Have an awesome week. Shorter video for today. Look at this. I'm going to keep it under 10 minutes. Bless you all. Stay warm. I'll see you next week. Bye. That's it for today's lesson. I really hope you enjoy your readings this week. Remember, allow yourself time to read as much as you can in one sitting. Don't get lost in the detail. Just keep going and watch the Bible's big story unfold before you. Remember also to hit me up on our social media channels or website, and I'll see you next time.